my youngest daughter used to be my son. And that in itself is obviously a transition, an identity change. And that affected me as well as her. And I'm going to touch on that a bit later because it's a big one, because it's not something that you come across every day. But, and I haven't got an idea really of how this is going to plan out today, because it's one of them subjects. And I told my man Jimbo, I said, I don't really want to do this one. And he said, this is probably the one you need to do, only because it's so personal. But when we look back at our lives, we all have identity shifts sometimes. You know, from a child to an adult. You know, there's an identity shift there. You grow into an adult, and there's a period, there's a point at some stage in your life when you're no longer dependent on your parents. You're no longer dependent on somebody else. You haven't got people telling you what to do. One of them classic ones, I think, especially on the modern era, is when someone goes from normal school to, say, sixth form or university, when there's a shift from you're being told what to do to it's your responsibility to get on with it. There's a shift. There's an identity shift in I'm responsible now. I'm independent of that formal school years to my further education. It happens when you leave education and you go into work. You know, you become, one minute you're a student and then you become a worker. You become someone in the workplace. So there's a shift there. So there's plenty of times when we shift. We could shift from employer to perhaps business owner, from being an ordinary guy to being a dad. There's lots of shifts. And we do this, and we do it naturally. We do it progressively. We don't even think about it. We don't sit there one day and say, well, today, I'm a dad today. You know, I was just some bloke down the pub 1 minute and now I'm a dad. And we do it seamlessly as well. Some of us don't do it well. The strongest force within a human being is to remain consistent with how we define ourselves. I want you to think about that for a moment. I learned that from a guy called Tony Robbins. You probably heard from yourself. The strongest force within a human being is to remain consistent with how we define ourselves. And identity runs into many other areas of your life, and someone else's identity can affect you as well. And I'll give you an example of that. And this is what I didn't really want to touch on because it's quite a difficult subject for me. My younger parenting skills was revolving my daughter and my son. You know, I had a daughter and I had a son. And then my son came home one day and had a feeble attempt at trying to commit suicide. And I say feeble attempt because she admitted to me afterwards. You know, it was a cry for help at the time. And Harry came out and said, look, I want to be Zoe now from now on. Now, this is quite a hot subject at the moment because, you know, there's a lot of stuff on transition and stuff like that. And you've got to remember, I'm an alpha male, right? And I've got my son, who's 6'7", by the way, coming out and saying, I want to be known as Zoe from now on. And this is a big thing because how do you fucking deal with that? Now, I had my own prejudice up to that point, and you know, I had a viewpoint of transgender people, very limited, I wouldn't say bigoted, but certainly a limited, narrow-minded view. Didn't understand it, had no idea of it, didn't even interest me, wasn't even on my radar. I'd heard people talking about it. And there's a sort of, and if we're honest with ourselves, there is a little judgment. And I noticed it with my family when I came out and told my family, I said that there's, Harry wants to be known as Zoe from now on. Some of the family just couldn't hack it. Well, it'll always be my little Harry, said my aunt. You think, oh. And it's a difficult one when someone is imposing it upon you. I want you to think about that. Your loved ones are running around, and one minute they go, well, no, I want to be this, or I want to do this, or I want to be that. And it might not be as big as transgender. It might be that they see themselves differently from now on. And we don't always like their choices, They might dress different. They might come home with loads of tattoos and piercings, or there's all sorts of things that people change about themselves, their identity, how they see themselves. And then they come along and they're sort of like, well, you've got to see me this way from now on. And you think, fuck, And it's hard. I promise you, it's fucking difficult. My little boy, who's now 6'7", my son, and you got to remember, as a parent, there'll always be your kids. No matter how old they are, there'll always be your kids. They're part of you. Wants to be a woman. And my first thoughts are, fuck, do you realize how much you're going to stand out? She stands out already, and now you're going to make it worse. And I had conversations with Zoe, and I was very blessed, very, very blessed, because I like to think I'm a progressive sort of guy. And one thing I learned then, and I urge you all to take this on board, because we all do it, right? We all do it. I was talking to Jimbo about this earlier, and it's that freedom to judge. We all judge. If you think about how much you judge other people, we just jump in there and just think whatever we think. We got the right to. That's our opinion, isn't it? We've got the right to our opinion. But when it comes to someone's identity, it's personal. It's fucking personal. You might say something that offends someone. Have you noticed that we've become very brittle? People are fighting for the gender community, transgender community, and it's usually someone who's not actually transgender. It's someone who's completely separate from it. But we're very quick to judge. And if you're going through that transition, or you're going through that identity shift, I urge you to be patient with those around you, because there's all sorts of implications. And I'll give an example of that. So I had a daughter and a son. My daughter was my princess, and all of a sudden she's now got a sibling that's no longer her brother. It's now her sister. And she's no longer my only little girl anymore. The implications of this are it's like a bomb going off, and the shockwave doesn't just go in one direction, it goes in multiple directions. It affects multiple people's lives. And so I've got not only my own feelings to consider, I've got Zoe's feelings to consider, I've got my ex-wife's feelings to consider, my wife's, and my daughter and my stepson, and I know it's hard for them. And I do remember the first Christmas, and I'm really old-fashioned. I love people around my house Christmas. I fucking love it. It's like around a dining table. I've got a dining room I hardly ever use, but Christmas and Easter and places and birthdays, it's always used. We should really knock through, really, but it's wasted room. But I just love it. Them times when we all get around a table, and I love cooking. And I love cooking for them, and I love that. And the first Christmas Zoe turned up, not as Harry or Zoe, it was awkward for everybody. Now, by this stage, I'd had conversations with her, and that was my main objective, was I want to see you however you turn up. It's your decision. I'll respect that decision. And my overriding as I say thought, it's not thought, it was my overriding mechanism, I suppose, was to make sure that Zoe felt accepted. Because acceptance is a big thing for anyone that's changing identity. And when Zoe passed, in fact, before she passed, we had conversations about the people in her community, the amount of parents that couldn't accept, that parental acceptance was big in the trans community, because the parents couldn't handle it, so they didn't accept. My role was, I don't understand it. I don't have to understand it. I've just got to accept that's Zoe's decision, not mine. And I said to her, made her fucking cry, bless her. I just said, I don't care how you fucking turn up. You're always my kid. And that's all that matters. And she spoke about her feeling of unconditional love from her dad, and knowing that her dad never judged her. We sat down and we had conversation. And because I didn't judge, I could have really difficult conversations with Zoe about what it was like for her. And she told me, she said, look, before I transitioned and before I became and put myself in that minority bracket, I didn't appreciate what it was like for someone of a minority to experience prejudice or, hate or misunderstanding. And then when she went through this transition herself, she went, wow. And it gave her a broader perspective of life and how they don't mean it. I don't think people go out deliberately to upset people. They just don't think. And this comes back to something I talk about, and it's one of my favorite subjects, is I believe that most people are walking around in what I call I mode. I mode. It's about me, right? I'm in center stage of my fucking world, and everyone's got to bow to my fucking will. They've got to understand where I'm coming from. And I've seen that in this transition journey of Zoe's transition. Other people didn't appreciate Zoe's position, was going, well, you don't know how you're making me feel in this circumstances. Well, it's not about you, it's about them. And if we can take ourselves out of our own shoes for a minute and just understand what it must be like for someone to come out and say, look, I'm 6'7" and I want to be a woman. And she said to me, Dad, if you think I had a choice in this matter, do you think I would have chosen to go down that route? No. No, Dad. She took her own life on the 3rd of October, 2022. And then we had an issue. Obviously, we've got grief to deal with. But the issue is, there's certain members of the family that want to honor Harry. What do you do when you're doing I can't remember what they call it now, when a eulogy. You do a eulogy for someone who's transitioned. I want you to think about that carefully, because this sort of shows you the complexities of, or using transgender as the main focus here because it's such an extreme measure. But the same principle goes for someone changing, from student to someone who's now working for a living. The identity shift is quite dramatic. But what do you do on a eulogy when you've got someone was known as Harry for 19 years, and then for 10 years, she's known as Zoe? And I looked at it from this perspective because I was her next of kin, and she left me the responsibility of dealing with her affairs. And that means dealing with her funeral. I want you to respect the fact that she saw herself as Zoe. So we're actually saying goodbye to Zoe. But I understand that a lot of the members of my family wanted to acknowledge Harry as well. I don't think we'll ever understand what it must be like for someone to come out and say, look, this is how I want to live from now on, to go through the operation, to accept that they're going to get ridiculed and ostracized, because they're two things that human beings don't like. So she accepted a long time ago that she's different, quite happy to be separate from most of society. And most of us never accept that. We don't like it. Think about yourself, right? Someone says something nasty about you, or a group. So this happens. I see this all the time. This drives me crazy. And I hear my mates go, oh, yeah, we formed a group. And then another group split from another group, which is, on WhatsApp. They have a little WhatsApp group. And then we find out that somebody else is having a little separate group. And then there's another subgroup of them separate groups. And you think, oh, man. And then people get upset because they're not in the group. Oh, fucking get over it, will you? Come on, get over it. It doesn't matter. Just accept that sometimes you're going to be separate. And that's what identity shifting can do sometimes. It can separate you. But let's bring it back down a few pegs. Let's just imagine you've got something going on, whether it's maybe a redundancy where you're no longer in that job anymore, and you've got a different path to take. How do you see yourself then, or how do you deal with that? Or maybe you've been for a relationship and you was married one day and now you're single. There's a whole chapter there, isn't there? So if you're going through a challenging time, there's a process which we go through, and that process is, I think, the very first one. This is so important. And if you remember me going back to the story about Zoe, it's acceptance. And once you've accepted what's the future or the change or the identity shift or with somebody else, and ask yourself the question, what's the meaning of this? What's the implications of this change? The bigger implications. How's it going to affect other people? How's it going to affect you deep down? Because a lot of the stuff that we go through is in our minds, and we process a lot, and you're very logical with your mind. But beyond that, you've got an emotional level to deal with. How do we cope with that emotional change? I had to park mine because it wasn't mine, it was Zoe's. If I go back to when I stopped drinking and saw myself as teetotal, then there was definitely an emotional change within me, because I had people looking at me going, yeah, it won't last, or I even had one guy say to me, this is bizarre. He said, "You've spoilt my drinking." So, how have I spoilt your drinking? Because I don't drink anymore. And so emotionally, I had a bit of a challenge because it pissed me off saying that. It's nothing to do with me. It's not my fault why you can't. So you've got all these things going on, and it's and understanding on an emotional level that you're going to feel things. People are going to piss you off, or they're going to trample all over something. Like my identity to be teetotal. They didn't agree with that. They were trying to trample on it. Fuck off. Power in that, by the way. Power. When you own it, it's powerful. When you own the identity and you are congruent with that, because that's another part of this process. You have to be congruent with the new identity or the route that you're going down. Have you ever met someone who proclaims something, but their behavior is telling you something completely different? A classic example is, anyone that says to you, "I'm going to tell you the truth. I never lie." Well, why are they telling you the truth and they never lie? Why are they telling you that? Perhaps because they fear they might be telling some porkies now and again, or you just see where I'm coming from on this. It's paying attention to if that person is congruent with how they're turning up. There's an old saying, right? There's an old saying, and this sort of bleeds into this quite nicely. Fake it till you make it. Have you ever heard that saying? And it's funny because we've done quite a few of these podcasts, these recordings. And a lot of if you listen to them all, there'll be themes that bleed into each other. And a classic for me would be when I start from scratch and I go into a new business. I don't ever see myself as a failed businessman, or it's not going to work, or it's what I do. It's part of me. So I embrace it regardless. So even though the business might be a fledgling business, to me, this is what we do. It's already happened. In my mind, I've already seen it. So it's like that sort of fake it till you make it. If you just turn up, classic example, I see someone who's confident, and I see someone who wants to be confident. Well, if you act confidently, guess what will happen? That'll be your default setting in the end. And it's only that in that process, there's a default setting that you need to change sometimes. You have to change that default setting because the old identity, do you remember if you're going to your computer now, you'll have default settings for your computer. Then you upgrade it and you've got to change the default settings because the default settings might have, classic example for that would be, I've got an internet browser I'm using, Safari, and then I upload Chrome and it'll ask you, do you want this to be your default setting? Well, actually, when you turn up with a new identity, yes, you need to change the default settings. Does this make sense? Are you still defaulting to the old you? Because I'm sure they crop up now and again. And remember I said about being congruent. If your default's still stuck on the old identity, it's not going to show up in the same way. You need to change it. So I want you to think about this for a second. If you have changed recently or you're about to change identities or careers or whatever it may be, ask yourself this question. What defaults am I still running? What old patterns are still there? What's showing up today? I mentioned earlier about if someone else is changing, especially if it's a big change. It's about acceptance, because I don't have to understand someone's plight. And I think this is really important in the general society nowadays. People think they need to understand someone's plight. You don't. And that breeds itself into hatred, into arguments. You see it online, people having to dig each other. I mean, Twitter's full of it. I mean, there's a lot of angry people on Twitter. It frightens me. But it's because they don't understand. And because they don't understand, they want to understand, so they attack. As opposed to, okay, acceptance. You teach that in the Bible about acceptance. You know, you may not be religious, maybe, but it's acceptance is probably the biggest thing I think you can offer someone who's going through a difficult transition or change in identity. And we saw it many, many years ago with the gay community, because obviously to be gay not that long ago was illegal, for fuck's sake. You know, how ridiculous is that? And they were underground, and there was, you know, people were indoctrinated into, your kid shouldn't be gay. So gay guys or gay girls grew up ashamed to be gay. Today, it's a different kettle of fish. And today we're very, very, very accepting of people in the gay community. And it's a case of, and I'm only using this as an example, only because of the parallels between the two were so divisive, you know, from the 50s and the 60s through to today, where it's completely changed. And I think anyone, if you ask anyone, even yourself, all you want to do is people just to accept you unconditionally, because there shouldn't be any conditions attached to anybody's choices or decisions. They may have an impact on you, and that's hard. It is hard. I know it from first-hand experience. It's fucking hard sometimes. But it's not about me, it's about them. And sometimes you have to park your feelings. Sometimes you have to park your prejudice. Doesn't matter whether it's trans, whether it's, you know, someone going through a horrendous divorce and then all of a sudden becoming single. And it might be someone you know who's going through a midlife crisis. You know that one? When all of a sudden you start questioning what your life's about and that identity that you attach to it. You see it a lot nowadays with parents where their kids have all left. They've got empty nest syndromes. And these two people left, you know, husband and wife left, who were mum and dad. And now in a situation where, fuck, what do we do now? And they look at each other and they have to accept and just be and allow each other to be. And if they do that, they grow together. If not, it rips them apart. It can rip families apart. And I've seen it so many times where there's no acceptance and there's judgment. Because, and this is what I'm going to leave you with. In order to have acceptance, it means then you can park judgment. You can leave it. Because none of us like to be judged, do we? None of us. And it's about time we practice acceptance on a bigger scale and allowed people to be who they want to be.